Welcome back to the Futurist New Deal podcast. I'm here with my friend David Shumaker, and we're going to talk about the February debate in New Hampshire, the New Hampshire primary, which is tomorrow, really the first of these primary events, although the Iowa Caucus we know was last week. We're going to look at some other recent events in the presidential election cycle. David, it's good to see you. Happy 2020, sir.
Yeah, it's always good to see you too, and happy 2020 and happy election cycle. This is fun times.
Yeah. I can say without irony that this is one of the more exciting years of my life.
Yeah, very good.
But it's always good to see you. We talk on a fairly regular basis, but this is our first podcast of the new year, so I thought I would say that as well. And we've been following pretty closely what's happening in presidential matters within our organization and on the national stage. Just last night, there was some treatment of the Iowa Caucus and of other matters, the Democratic debate in New Hampshire, on Saturday Night Live, which was hosted by, I think, a lovely transhumanist, RuPaul, and very funny lady, nevertheless. And one of my favorite characters in history on Saturday Night Live, Larry David, as Bernie Sanders, made an appearance, which is quite funny. But folks, if you didn't get a chance to watch that, turn on your DVR and have a good chuckle. But we're here to talk, of course, about the New Hampshire debate, which was just 3 nights past, and we both had a chance to watch that debate and read that debate. What were your impressions of the candidates' showings on that event, David?
Yeah. By the way, I want to comment on Saturday Night Live first before we jump into that. I did not get a chance to say that, but I'm going to. And I'm just wondering when I get a chance to look at it, whether that's going to be funnier than the Iowa caucuses or not. But we shall see. We shall see.
I would say it's pretty much in a dead heat at this point.
Yeah, very good.
The Iowa caucuses were a little bit of a debacle, quite the debacle. And there's a lot of finger pointing, particularly, I think, in the Sanders camp. We already mentioned Senator Sanders in another context. But a lot of finger pointing there, but from many Democrats and an awful lot of Republicans and independents as well, taking an interest in this app malfunction and other difficulties in Iowa. Iowa is effectively the traditional first big event of the campaign season. And in the last 2 elections, the campaign season is extended rather longer. This one particularly. You and I both remember previous election cycles where that wasn't the case, where things were starting to kick in gear around the first of the year and starting to become more visible around this time. What is your impression of this longer election cycle, David?
Well, the longer election cycle is interesting in itself, but let's start with the Iowa caucuses and slowly move forward.
Yes.
Iowa's been interesting, for many election cycles, and it's usually set the tone of, well, maybe it didn't set the tone, but certainly started to shape the tone of what was to come. I think this election cycle, back to your question, is exacerbated by what went on in Iowa, because there was clearly no frontrunner coming out of it. You had Buttigieg claiming victory, you had Sanders claiming victory. At one point, they were apart by 0.1%. We had no clear focus coming out of there. We had plenty of finger pointing, as you pointed out. And the finger pointing just wasn't with Sanders, but maybe the biggest finger pointing was in the Biden camp. Here's your national front runner making a dismal showing by any stretch of the imagination coming out of Iowa. What does this have to do with the longer election cycle? Well, perception of this election cycle maybe being the longest in history, whether it's that way chronologically or not, will probably go down that way just because of the really nebulous start to this whole thing. We're not getting any shaping. New Hampshire, it'll be interesting to see what happens there and if that tends to sharpen it up. But we already have candidates backpedaling on New Hampshire. Biden, I've already mentioned, is one, and there are others talking about, well, this is a long process and we're going to have to do this and this and this. So all this, to me, looks like we've got 7 candidates now. 8 if you count Bloomberg, who hasn't officially competed so far yet, but will. And I think the number of candidates is going to stay large. That field is going to stay large for a considerable period of time.
So you don't think that
the early part of this is going to drag on much longer than it has in past election cycles, making this feel like a very long election cycle. So I think we can get weary out of the whole thing.
It's both chronologically and psychologically long.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And maybe the psychological is the most important of the two. What do you think about that?
Yes, I think that's an interesting insight. I wonder about this because I follow the analysis of this sort of thing fairly closely. So I had read articles from as early as September saying that Biden would be out of the race by April, and that Biden would have a poor showing in these first few horse races. He would hem and haw and might drop out by the end of Q1 even, and that was not the prevailing sentiment, perhaps because the mainstream media has an interest in people like Biden. He is a celebrity vice president, so to speak, and was effectively the incumbent of 2016 had he run. So this is a sort of personnel, aside from the politics of the mainstream media tending to want to prop up center-right Democrats. And Biden is not my candidate of choice. David, we have a lot of sort of scratchy. I'm going to make a note of the time code here. I messaged you, but it was on the other platform. Do you know where your microphone is? It sounds like you might be tapping the microphone.
I am going to quit touching the laptop computer. I have been reaching out and adjusting the display, and maybe that's it. So we'll see. You let me know if it improves or not.
Okay, I'll make a note of this time code 1525. Yes, so of Biden, we could say that while I perhaps have a sort of perverse enjoyment of his failure, there are many other matters there. But I don't think it's a perverse enjoyment because it is born out of a genuine interest in seeing humane economic policies advanced in these United States. I feel that, in fact, in your and my pre-interview, we discussed in passing the concept of life extension, and a little later, you and I will be discussing. After this podcast, I actually will be discussing the strategy of presenting a life extension message on a national stage. I will be on a national stage on March the 4th, and I am in this game, so to speak, to advance life extension. So, for example, I could make a more techno-progressive message or a more accelerationist message, talking about more singularitarian notions or more earthbound policy, near-term policy messages. But I feel fairly confident in the pace of techno-progress. I don't feel quite so confident in the acceptance and utilization of life extension biomedicine. And that saddens me, but it is, so I have often considered weighing whether I should, for example, take the strategy that I imagine Zoltan Istvan might take and talk about the jobless apocalypse, talk about reasons why a techno-futurist should be a politician. But I would prefer to talk about life extension, but there is a specific set of strategies there. We don't want a message to fall on deaf ears because people don't have the language to receive and process it. But someone like Joe Biden doesn't have the language of this kind at all, to my mind. He is focusing almost solely on thinking about the concerns of blue dog Democrats, people who are particularly interested in protecting their donor base and protecting the base of power in their organization, of these sort of people that I've termed center-right Democrats, and not focusing on human development and the best outcomes for the citizen. And honestly, I agree with something that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said. I find her to be quite fascinating, and people often accuse her of being inarticulate, but I find her to be quite quotable, so I'll quote her now. She said that in any other country in the world, herself and Joe Biden would not be in the same political party. These are different worldviews, dramatically so in my view. And I would tend to support the worldview that advances humane economic policies, but particularly in the interest of seeing that everyone in this country has the right to live as long as they might care to. And I think that this set of public health goals should be treated as a basic human right enshrined in the Bill of Rights and so forth.
Well, there's a lot in what you're saying. I'd like to jump in and take little pieces of it and maybe provide some feedback on that. So one of the themes that I'm hearing from what you were saying was talking about transhumanism, was talking about long life, and talking about public acceptance. And believe it or not, I'm still going to take this back to the Iowa caucuses. And here's where I'm going with that. I have read and heard commentators talk about the app being at fault. I've heard discussion about people claiming about how technology failed. And I think from a transhumanist point of view, especially one that's interested in living a very long time, and that those kind of conversations are dangerous for us. I'm a technologist. I come out of that area of doing infrastructure for information technology, implementation and support of that. And from my viewpoint, the app was not the problem. That was a symptom of a deeper problem. And you've touched on that a little bit. If you look at what to me looks like the old guard of the Democratic Party, is an aversion to, in prior campaigns, using social media, for example, and did not use it effectively as the Republican Party did. It hasn't really come up in the media, but the Republicans were also using an app. Now, granted, they only essentially had one candidate, and perhaps usage of it was easier from that standpoint. But I can tell you from implementing any kind of information technology infrastructure, all these things need to have a good development plan. And importantly, they need to have a multi-fold testing plan. And these things need to be evaluated before they go hot, before, in this case, they're used on the day of the caucus. That clearly, to me, looks like that did not happen. Sure, bugs can get through, but what I've read is, to me, would seem once again that even a modest amount of testing would have revealed the problem. Not only does the product have to be good, the app itself, but you have to train users. So there was massive issues with people not being able to sign in. And then there needs to be an effective support system for the new product and for the new users. And I didn't see that either. So it's not that the technology failed. The implementation of a technology failed. But people can then become adverse to saying, well, we need to go back to doing this with pencil and paper, and we need to do it the old trustworthy way, and we can't trust the new technology. And I'm afraid of bleed over into that area, in the area of super longevity, because the same kind of things come into play. It's not just the technology, it's the testing, it's the education, and it's having the proper support systems in place. So I, for one, have been making a bit of a joke out of the Iowa caucuses, but there's some serious lessons to be learned there, and those need to be articulated. And who I would love to see those being articulated by are candidates like Andrew Yang, for example. That should be right in his wheelhouse to be able to talk about things like that. Being the technology entrepreneur, and with the message that he more understands, I think, where the future is headed, and that reaching back to systems from antiquity, if you will, to be our savior is something that we as transhumanists really, really want to shy away from.
Yes.
So,
yes.
as I look at the mainstream of that party, and I look at well, I don't know if mainstream is the right word, but the old guard of the party, and I would think that Biden would be the candidate of the old guard of the party. I would be afraid of that message being spread, as we move forward.
Yes. And the opportunity cost to a sort of anti-digitalization sentiment across this country is substantial. So while the concerns about a democratic process are themselves legitimate, they are in many, many ways terribly misguided. And I think that our loyal listeners are fairly familiar with some of these ideas. These are people who are tending to be news junkies, or at least people who have some understanding of the news cycle. They know what happened in Iowa. So what I'd like to do now in discussing Iowa very quickly is talk about some conspiracy theories that have arisen in Iowa, because perhaps not everyone might be quite as familiar with those. So this is I'm referencing an article from just a few days ago in PolitiFact that attempts to address the conspiracy theories around this. And we should say that, to my mind, the literal conspiracy theory, the role there is not what is important. What is more important is what you have said, that this is a deflection strategy on the part of the folks in power to draw focus away from their sort of misdeeds and mistakes in this by blaming a third party, and a nebulous third party at that, the technology. So it doesn't matter so terribly much to me whether this organization Shadow, the tech company that developed this application, was literally in league with Hillary Clinton and company, because the net effect is much the same with problems of this kind. It's sometimes said of politics, it's a big club and you aren't in it. And these folks have all worked together, and mistakes of this kind, they always seem to land in a certain way. And it's no coincidence after you see dozens and dozens of things of this kind that tend to work in favor of this kind of deflection, and work in favor of these people who are basically Republicans who dominate the Democratic rank and file, as opposed to these reform-minded folks who I am admittedly more sympathetic to. So an organization called Shadow was the one who developed this application. A spooky name. Perhaps that in itself could be why some of these conspiracy theories have been launched around this. But they did make some mistakes, and they did work closely with the sort of curators of the very sort of mechanisms that we have described here. There's many other kinds of things like this. Before I turn over to you on Iowa, I suppose we can also make mention of someone who we haven't discussed at all, Pete Buttigieg, who is more or less the beneficiary of these series of mistakes or misdeeds, depending how you like to look at it. And we can discuss how that has affected the event in question, the New Hampshire primary, and particularly the New Hampshire debate, which we wanted to discuss a little bit more. Any thoughts on the conspiracies around this app? Just an overall assessment, or your feelings about New Hampshire?
Yeah, I have plenty, actually. So I love conspiracy theories, which does not mean I believe in them. I enjoy them for their entertainment value.
Mm-hmm.
But I've noticed some common traits in conspiracy theories that may apply to this one about Iowa as well. So when you say conspiracy theories, the things that come to mind are the flat earthers
Mm.
and the we never landed on the moon people.
You
Now
know,
there are
this
plenty
is
of
an
others.
interesting distinction because I just want to interject that historically in the 20th century, conspiracy theorists were people who were attempting in their own way to speak truth to power, and often were. But in this social media era, conspiracy theorists have evolved into GastroTurf entities, people who are spreading quite stupid misinformation that has been seeded by organizations to have the opposite effect. The flat earthers and the people who deny these. So there's been a move from people who are have a certain kind of fear-based thinking to have a certain kind of reactionary, but in some way reform-minded thinking. A dramatic shift in the tenor of conspiracy theorists to folks who are basically just spreading stupid memes that are being seeded by right-wing entities who pay for this sort of.
Well, the thing that I wanted to point out that the commonality that I see is an aversion to science.
Mm-hmm.
So if you talk about the flat earthers or the we never landed on the moon types, scientific arguments do not work with them. Technological arguments do not work with them. Their cognitive biases are already set up to filter those sort of things out. Mm. And I see that if I wanted to create a conspiracy theory around anything else, that those elements would work well in doing that. So whether Iowa is a true conspiracy or not, I don't know. What I do know, though, is that if it is, it's been crafted well, because the idea of blaming the app, blaming technology, the people that you would sell that conspiracy theory to already have an aversion to the science and to the technology to begin with. So confirmation bias comes in, and it's like, I told you so. We need paper ballots and that sort of thing. Now, to your point, I think these things do need good critical analysis. And then from there, we can make informed decisions. Let's not be like the people that are aversion to using critical matrix to determine, the veracity of something in particular. So I'm open to your point about the fact that just because something's labeled a conspiracy theory doesn't mean that it may not be true.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But critical thinking and using valid valid sources for that critical thinking are of utmost importance.
Yes. And if you look at the conspiracy theories that consumed the 20th century versus the very late 20th and 21st century, the two that you mentioned are basically 21st century phenomenon. The ones that consumed the 20th century, perhaps the most visible one is the concerns around the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, which has almost nothing to do with technophobia or anti-science sentiments. Very few of those, although some preoccupations around nuclear war and some of these other kinds of conspiracy theories in that sort of a list of 20th century conspiracy theories did have strong technophobic elements, but they weren't having this underhanded and seemingly credible through line of being of playing to know nothing. These this conspiracy theorists were often the more educated people, maybe somewhat agitated people, but educated people, not people who were grabbing onto the very dumbest ideas that not the sort of people who would be believing in angels and aliens and silly sort of things. Although maybe aliens is sort of an intermediary between the two. Yes, but I digress. So what is your impression of Pete Buttigieg? Is he a good man?
I think he is a good man, and he's certainly articulate. And you are right in that coming out of New Hampshire, he got a boost, maybe not the kind of boost that a dedicated front runner would normally get coming out of Iowa, but he did get a boost. I think he gained credibility, enough so that the debate that we came to talk about, He had a target on his back, as any perceived frontrunner would.
Mm.
And I think for the most part during that debate, I think he handled himself quite well. There were a few areas where I don't think he did. The question that could be called the race question, talking about his time as mayor of South Bend and some of the statistical data that was brought up there. He's going to have to do better with that answer in the future.
Yes.
But overall, to answer your question, I think at his heart he's good, and I think he's looking to promote things for a great many people, and I think he can be very articulate, and he has both the advantage and the liability of youth, and the fact that he is the youngest in the field, and that can be a boost, as JFK was during his time. And it could also be something that people can challenge him on. Say if you compare to Biden, who's in his 70s at some point.
But other candidates still in play. Yang and Klobuchar have a glow of youth about them.
They do, and Klobuchar, since you brought her up, I think she also did quite well in the debate. I think she came off as tough, but not, I don't know. She came off as tough and likable, I think, at the same time, is what I'm struggling to say, which can be a difficult thing to do. I think her talking about how well she's done running in a red state, in red districts, and then being able to carry people with her, not just her own personal successes, I think those were very valid. So she has been polling low from what I understand. I'd be interested to see what, well, the ultimate poll that's, coming up on Tuesday looks like. But I wouldn't be surprised to see her get a significant bump up in New Hampshire, and I'd be interested in where those voters come from. And if they come out of the Biden camp, then Biden's already predicting that he may not do well there. Once again, he may do worse than predicted, and that has to mean something as well.
Yes, and from my vantage point of someone who is focused on humane economic policies and the implementation ultimately of a public health service that treats aging as a disease, giving everyone this option to live just as long as they care to. I view people like Klobuchar and Buttigieg. They both kind of have names that do and don't roll off the tongue. But I view them as the sort of people, again, from my own vantage point, a rather stock American character of the late 20th and early 21st century, a person who would say, I am socially liberal, but economically rather conservative, which is a foolish thing to say. It's what Charles Koch says of himself as well, a man who is responsible for, directly or indirectly, I believe, an awful lot of people dying because of the implementation of inhumane economic policies and austerity measures that have been foisted upon us by a lot of shenanigans and social conservative double talk. I regard this impulse of the DCCC powers that be as very much trying to foist into the limelight these quote unquote social liberals but economic conservatives. This, you can imagine, even I don't want to keep harping on Iowa because I do want to, but you can imagine this conversation. So the Clintons, who are the ostensible power players of previous years of these organizations, are on record saying we cannot give this party to the Bernie people. We cannot give this party over to these economic populists. And you can imagine them saying, well, New Hampshire is probably, there's no way that we can have a tie or have a Buttigieg pulling ahead in New Hampshire, but we can cook the books a little bit in Iowa, and then at least it doesn't look like these fucking commies are just won the whole first round. And that's exactly what has happened. Everyone knows this. The extent to which this is something that we can point to provable malfeasance is, of course, another matter. But this is why people on the right who may not have the most earnest of always have the most earnest of interest in this are won't stop talking about it either.
Let me just interject a question, if you don't mind, before we move on. So if I understand, then this is a DNC move, but does this DNC move support the Republicans? And that's the Republicans have made quite a heyday out of what went on in Iowa, showing ineptitude on the Democratic Party side. So is the DNC inadvertently playing into the Republicans' hands?
Yes, time and time again, not necessarily so inadvertently. This is effectively a sort of if you view the two parties as being dominated by special interests, you could say that we have a special interest one-party system, and that one-party system would sacrifice small gains on the part of either, particularly the Democrats, in the interest of maintaining that base of power, that special interest government monopoly. So yes, it's not inadvertent in my view. It is systematic and fairly consistent. It's not as if this Iowa app is the first of a kind of thing like this to occur. Every time there's a mistake, it always seems to land on that side of the fence. That we could mention dozens and dozens of incidents of this kind. We could mention, there are very, very few people who followed this last presidential election cycle very closely who don't say, well, there's Russiagate and there's Cambridge Analytica. Those are legitimate concerns. Also, a legitimate concern is the treatment of the DNC of their economic populist wing that was dominating the organizational in these past two presidential campaigns, dominating the grassroots, but they sort of expelled them from the ordinary system using these dirty tricks that they have at their disposal. This is something that happened a lot in 2016. It's something that we're going to see an awful lot more of in 2020, and plenty of articles being written on that, speculating on that matter. I could share some with us in the comments.
How did you see this play out, if at all, during the New Hampshire debate?
Yeah, well, I mean, a debate. The debaters were pretty evenly matched, and this was not an exciting affair by the standards of the other debates. There was no moment of Elizabeth Warren asking a candidate why he's in the election at all if he doesn't want to do anything. There was no coup de grace of any kind, or even real moves of any kind.
What about Joe Biden getting everybody to their feet to clap for the outgoing lieutenant colonel from the White House?
Yes, Vindman, and an understandable sentiment. So yeah, there was nobody had a terribly poor showing. Even these people, the Tom Steyers, who we don't have a particular interest in as techno-futurists, and who are not polling so terribly well, comported himself well. Tom Steyer fans look at that debate and say Tom Steyer did great. There wasn't. I don't know that those dirty tricks necessarily affected this particular event, this most recent debate. But in some way, they affect these things as a matter of course. Just as we have had so many recent discussions about ballot access measures and the rules that the DNC imposes upon people like Tulsi Gabbard or Andrew Yang, who was not in one of the recent debates, and they are not designed to represent the will or best interests of people. They are very much a series of thresholds designed to make this a pay-to-play kind of operation.
Yes, you brought up Andrew Yang, one of the people whose policies I really like a lot of, UBI, and him understanding automation, and I think he probably has the best view of that of any of the candidates, or at least he articulates it. But his debate performance in New Hampshire, I was surprisingly cold to it. He didn't have his hand up a lot of the time on issues I wish he would have talked about. And when he did talk on some of them, I'm not sure really how well he connected with the audience. I would like to have seen more there. As much as I said Buttigieg was articulate and spoke well on most of the points, I didn't feel like my personal favorite, Andrew Yang, was that, and that was disappointing. I also watched the after show on ABC where each one of the candidates came out and spoke, and I may have missed it, but Andrew Yang was the only one that I didn't see go into that arena. Everyone else did, and some had better showings than others, but once again, I was disappointed.
Now that is interesting, and he also did endorse Sanders. He threw his votes in the Iowa caucus to Sanders, if I'm not mistaken. And but also think about somebody like Liz Warren, who is still polling well enough that in the back and forth of these sorts of things could very well ultimately be the nominee. But look at her performance at the New Hampshire debate that we are discussing. She wasn't doing quite, she did precisely what you said Yang did as well. She wasn't as vocal, and she didn't have quite so much talk time as previous. And again, that could be owing to many factors, but it is perhaps owing to, they've been doing this for a year. And she perhaps thought that she would be doing better. She didn't think that she would be being beat by some sort of altar boy alderman of Buttigieg. This is not.
Did you come up with that on your own? That's pretty good.
Compared to someone like, yeah, I did. I haven't heard that turn of phrase before. That's pure caffeine speak. Compared to someone like Elizabeth Warren is a public policy virtuoso. Whatever she is or isn't, she knows both the DCCC and reform politics like the back of her hand, like she knows her own name. And Pete Buttigieg has basically just bluffed his way into this thing. He's very articulate, but he's a small town mayor. He's never worked in this job. And so there's somebody. So for somebody like Warren to be beaten by somebody like Buttigieg, she's probably a little bit sort of having a kind of a WTF moment to some degree. But this has been going on for a long time. Also, sometimes people do bide their time in situations like this, and it's very difficult to truly say. Who do you think might drop out next of these 8 mainstream presidential Democrats?
I forgot to tell you not to ask me any really hard questions. No, seriously, that is a difficult question. I think that if I was looking at this in previous cycles, I would take, the bottom pollers. So I would go with Yang, Steyer, maybe even Klobuchar if she was not ascending, which I think she'll do. And those would be in there. However, Steyer's got the money to stay.
Yeah.
Yang has a quite a good organization, I think, behind him.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's just the fact that I really like a lot of what he expresses makes it hard for me to say that he could be one of those that's on the fence. Or maybe it'll be somebody very surprising to us. Maybe we have somebody that continues to drop away like Biden and can't, I think South Carolina, perhaps, as I look ahead, if he doesn't do well in South Carolina, then as we move into that, what did you call it, blue collar South, blue dog Democrats, if he doesn't do well there, he could be the surprise one that moves away, going from initial front runner to one of the big ones to move.
Yes.
Or it could be, like Buttigieg came off of a bump, I think, out of Iowa. I think he's going to do reasonably well in New Hampshire. But then, as we move into the other states where some of the other candidates are maybe more popular, it'd be interesting to see what happens going to Nevada. Maybe somebody like him could fall away. So you get the quick rise and then the quick drop.
Yeah,
So to
that's
answer
quite
your
possible.
question,
Judge is
I
not going to
don't
win
know.
California, New York. Yeah.
Yeah. So give me your take on that.
Well, I would say there's what I want, which is for somebody to drive a stake into Joe Biden's heart. And there's what I think would happen, which is
Silver stake, right?
that probably one of those two billionaires will decide that they're tired of spending their own money on this undertaking, and because they have spent a lot of money, but also someone like Yang is probably would be a pretty good guess. That would be, I think, unfortunate to the techno progressive community, but
Absolutely.
yeah, yeah. The yeah, it's a difficult question, and it is also sometimes these things might surprise you. There are also some 4 or 5 other Democratic candidates who are in the public eye, who are still in this race, who we haven't even made mention of. So I would say those are the ones who probably will drop out.
True.
And I like Tulsi Gabbard, so that I think that would be unfortunate. Some of those others I don't see as much I don't see as much in, but yes, I would.
But let me pose a question then. So let's say that you got your wish and Biden dropped out here in the short term.
Mm-hmm.
Does that benefit Mike Bloomberg? And does he get taken on then as the party's mainstream candidate that they want to see put forward? What do you think the effect of?
Well,
my question is, what's the effect of Biden dropping out on Bloomberg?
Yeah, I mean, it benefits all the folks who. It doesn't specifically benefit Bloomberg to a high degree. It benefits Buttigieg and Klobuchar, but it would benefit all of those people who aren't Bernie Sanders or Liz Warren. Yeah. So yeah, that would probably be. I mean, I don't necessarily expect. I think that I would stick to that analysis that that Joe Biden will drop out before the before the Democratic convention in July. But I don't have a lot more analysis besides as to what week or day that will occur. These other folks, I mean, it's the same thing. Sometimes it's legitimately it's a political punchline. Oh my, I have to focus on my family. I have to leave the rest to spend time with my wife, spend time with my children. But sometimes things of this kind are very much the driving decisions. Overwhelmingly, things of this kind, when people drop out, they are factors. Those things are not predictable in terms of these kind of strategies to a high degree. But yeah, it is. Well, we have. I wanted to discuss a little bit about Nevada because I'm planning to travel to Nevada for a day or two to meet up with a friend, a techno-progressive politician who is running for Congress, for a state Congress, California. Our friend Jason Mallory, and he's a techno-futurist thinker and policymaker who I do rather admire. And we were possibly planning to spend a day or two in Nevada around the time of the Nevada Caucus, which is happening throughout the state. We should mention it's not so localized to one particular set of events as a convention would be. So it's difficult to, for example, predict where we might best go to be conducting interviews and making things happen. But I may also go and spend a little bit of time in Sacramento doing some campaigning there around this time as well. But you have been involved in the Nevada Caucus. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that experience as we're as we're wrapping up our analysis of these events?
Yeah, happy to. I live in Arizona these days, but prior to living in Arizona, I spent more than a decade in Nevada. And I was drawn into the caucus by Barack Obama's entry into the presidential race. And I went as an observer, I thought, to just see how the process works. Understanding a primary is fairly easy. But anyway, for a caucus, that would be different. And I ended up going to essentially the polling place where I was at, which is a high school gymnasium. And people came in, much like in Iowa, you were asked to go and stand with all the people that were supporting the same candidate as you and to talk. And then we were able to go and talk in other areas as well. And then at some point, we were polled as far as who we were in favor of. So I went in favor of Obama, and I nothing that I heard there changed my mind. And one of the things that was really nice versus going for an election in the caucus, it's an interactive thing. So at some point, we were asked to draw people from our crowd of Obama supporters and come up and talk about why we favored this particular candidate. And that happened, in all the other candidate groups as well. So I was one of those people that did that, and then was nominated and elected to go to the county convention and then later on to the state convention. So I got quite an education in Nevada politics. And this all started out as an observational exercise. So my point of the story here is, wherever you're listening to this from, if you have an opportunity to go to a caucus, I highly suggest that you do. I think you'll enjoy the experience, and I think there is a lot to learn there. Now, we didn't have any of the major candidates show up in the particular area that I was at, and I don't know how that's decided. Perhaps it's decided by where they think they can have the biggest impact. I would say reasonable. So if the candidates did show up for that, I can tell you that when convention time came around, though, that was different, because then, as you pointed out, that was a very focused group of people, and candidate or candidate representatives showed up to talk. And I would encourage you to do those things as well. If you have any interest at all, eliminate the filter of Ben and I talking about it. Eliminate the filter of listening to news feeds about it. Go and see for yourself. That's what I would say.
Indeed. This is something that's been sorely lacking in previous decades, a lack of engagement on the part of citizens in these processes. And it is something that I do believe is a duty of all of us. And so I would echo those sentiments. I'm going to ask you another tough question. I said I wouldn't. Here I am. Another sort of prediction. I have talked about how I think that Sanders Warren would be a good ticket. Now, as we're looking at New Hampshire, for example, someone like Warren dropping out at this precise moment, endorsing Sanders and joining his ticket, an unlikely turn of events in the next 36 hours. But something like that would probably give a short-term boost to the Sanders campaign in these next series of events. But there might be other strategies that might be tactically wise, but strategically unwise. If the interest, as I believe, is in setting the stage for a public health service that can ultimately treat aging as a disease and doesn't have people falling through the cracks, I believe that Liz Warren is somebody who has the political acumen and the dedication to do that. I think that Bernie Sanders has that dedication as well. What do you see in strategies of this kind? More palace intrigues. Do you think that would be helpful to Sanders if that were to occur in the coming days? Do you think that it might be better to do that at a later date?
Those are all good questions, and actually, I find them very interesting, and I ask myself those on a regular basis. I've been playing the what if games, and the one what if that you brought up with Sanders Warren is one that I've run through on that. I'm thinking, to me, they seem so well aligned. Wouldn't it be better have all of their delegates in one camp instead of divided by two, since we have so many people in play, at least the ones that are getting national attention. So the ones that, the 7 that were on stage for New Hampshire, for example. So clearly, I would agree that I think it is obvious that it would be a short-term boost. I think the bigger question you alluded to is what's timing look like? How do you get the boost at the right time going to the convention? And I think some of that has to do with what happens as other people drop out.
Yes, yes.
And on top of that, I think you then also have to look at the other palace intrigues that you are talking about. As you look at the party centralists, as you say, maybe they do something as well. Maybe something like, in no particular order, but you have Biden, who is the old guard, grabbed somebody who has youth on their side and is very articulate and can bring people along. From that standpoint, maybe they do something much the same way, especially if one of them really starts to take a dive in the polls as time goes forward. So timing for any of these is going to not just be their own internal timing. They're going to have to look at what other things could happen. And if this is not settled by the time of the national convention, then you want to be riding on some type of high going into that. So maybe, just maybe the answer is, whether it's the progressives or whether it's the centralists or whoever, they don't make these moves until later versus sooner.
Yes, it's interesting, and I think that because of this sort of the prospect of Warren still winning this race, it's unlikely that from a personal standpoint she'll make that sort of sacrifice. But I don't want to dance on my friend's grave, so to speak. Andrew Yang does check some of the boxes as a running mate that Elizabeth Warren would check. He has a populist, an economic populist street cred that other people who have a K Street cred, who have been thrown about, and who are people like Stacey Abrams or many others, potential vice presidents. They don't necessarily occupy the space of being viewed as legitimately reform-minded in the way that Yang or Warren do. Although I don't think that's fair of Stacey Abrams. She's undertaken a tremendous amount of electoral reform efforts. Very credible, creditable. And this is basically a popularity contest, and so we have to think of these things in sometimes rather stark terms. So I would think that a Yang Sanders presidential ticket would be similarly interesting, and something that could happen in the coming days, much more likely than Sanders Warren, because Yang is a little bit running out of steam. He has that credibility. He's endorsed Sanders in various ways. He's fired some staff. He's not making the rounds the way that he was. So whether he's on the outs or not is a separate matter from whether he would be Sanders vice president, and whether Sanders is going to make that play. I said that there needed to be a lot more vice presidential palace intrigues. Every time you flirt with a vice president and then don't do it, that's like a huge amount of ink above the fold that's devoted to you. So if you meet up and shake hands with, if Sanders meets up and shake hands with Jon Stewart and says Jon Stewart should be president someday, then that's smart. But these guys, they don't do that. They don't. They're running more kind of focused in some ways campaigns, and they don't want to make. They have people telling them you can't make a mistake with these VP games because it could hurt you, and you don't have to commit to that yet. But it's interesting because I think that having a very popular vice president like a Jon Stewart who might not have wanted to be Sanders president, vice president, but could have been the difference between Sanders winning in 2016 or not. And it could very well then have been the difference between 10,000 more people walking around in the sunshine because they still had health care, or 100,000 people by a certain measure. That's these things, these decisions, they have consequences, and an unwillingness on the part of people like Sanders and Warren to work together. These things have consequences as well. This has been a fascinating discussion. Did you have any other things that you wanted to discuss? Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Nevada, or our upcoming March 4th debate after all of those? Any final thoughts?
Plenty of thoughts, but let's fast forward to the March 4th debate, because that's one that I'm going to be there in attendance, of course, cheering you on.
Yes.
And I'm looking forward to that, because that's another side of politics. We've talked about New Hampshire, we've talked about Iowa, but what's going on in Chicago on March 4th is an opportunity, I think, for a lot more diverse viewpoints to come together. Viewpoints, perhaps, that, in my opinion anyway, are closer to the people. So I am very, very much looking forward to that, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing you and the others in a national audience. So there is the kind of exposure to this, and people can understand there's more to politics than just what you see on the evening news.
Yes, and just how we've seen so many institutions evolving in recent years, a lot of that driven by social media, a lot of that driven by reform-minded initiatives, a lot of that driven by disgust with dysfunction. But we've seen this longer election cycle, for example. The development of this free and equal March 4th event, which I encourage you all to attend. It's occurring the afternoon and evening of March 4th. That's a Wednesday, just over 3 weeks from now, at the Chicago Hilton. The tickets are $10. We'll link in the comments and description to that affair. Please do attend. If you know anyone in the Chicago area, please do attend. An event like this has never occurred before. This is rather quite a unique and interesting event. A debate in the primary season that is open to candidates from so many different parties. This is a novel event for something of this kind to be happening with the orchestration of people of the caliber of the Free and Equal Election Foundation. And I would also like to say, I don't want to toot my own horn, but just to a high degree, the germ of the idea of that event, if not the actual organization, was mine own. I had started to organize a separate event that evolved into this March 4th event. So I would encourage folks to please check that out, and also go to freeandequal.org. They're also going to be working with a partner called Nexus, who is a developer of a blockchain voting app. So they're very much not only in the electoral reform business, but also in the techno progress business. And you should find ways to support them by attending this event, by telling your friends and loved ones about this event, and by supporting initiatives of this kind that are very much of the 21st century.
If you've enjoyed this show and would like to see more, please like and subscribe. And also check out benzion2020.com for updates on the campaign, and to go to